Today we have an incredible special guest with us. We have Miss Dr. Sonya Horsford, Associate Professor of Educational Leadership at Columbia University and the author of the book Learning in a Burning House, Educational Inequality, Ideology, and Disintegration. We'd like to welcome Dr. Horsford today, and our interviewers shall be Miss Angela Bodley, Miss Gaelle Laurore, and Miss Darshni Patel. They will be asking the questions, and we're going to open this up and engage in an in-depth conversation about education, inequality, and all the things that's impacting students within the educational system.
To start off, are there any specific instances you feel hinder your education and growth as a student and as a person?
Good morning. So, can you repeat the question?
Are there any specific instances you feel hindered your education and growth as a student and as a person?
Well, I think we can still learn from and through overcoming barriers. So, I don't know if there's things that have maybe limited my education, but maybe some stumbling blocks that have helped me to kind of learn about challenge, to learn how to overcome. And to learn how to navigate systems that might make it difficult for certain students to be successful.
Have you ever experienced one of those systems, like, such as teachers, parents, anyone, like, has anyone ever been in your way to, like, hinder that?
Yes, so I actually had an experience, and I've been thinking about how I want to share it, that happened in high school. And I'm actually working on an article now that talks about that experience a little bit. And I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada, went to school in the 80s and early 90s, and had a real diverse group of friends and students, came from all different cultures and backgrounds. And so I had a good, I think, diverse schooling experience where I got to learn from people who, were like me and also not like me. One of the challenges I did experience was in my senior year. I was a good student. I got straight A's. I did well, and I was slated to become the salutatorian of the high school based on my GPA. But at the start of the year, and I was going to take a shorter load because I had all my credits. I was just going to do like a half day my senior year. And my counselor at the time, Roland Chapman, said, look, I think you should really take all of the classes that you need just to make sure that everything works out at the end of the year. Like, I'm fine, I got this, no worries. He talked to my parents as well. African-American educator, one of the few that I had throughout my high school experience. So near the end of the year, there is a question as to whether or not I should be the salutatorian. And the principal decided that they wanted to give the opportunity to the person who actually had a lower GPA than me. And so that year was filled with meetings with my parents coming in, her parents coming in, with the principal, with the superintendent of the school system. And ultimately, they had decided that they would make us co-salutatorians. And so for me, I think that experience showed me that while we're told to work hard, get good grades, and do those things, that still there is a system that may not want certain students to succeed or to be recognized for their success. And I think that has informed my interest in looking at issues of race and opportunity in schools in particular, and making sure that racism, sexism, classism, and other barriers do not make it difficult for students to be able to access the education they deserve.
Working in a top-tier university, do you feel like that space has been welcoming for people like you?
That's a great question. It's been an interesting experience. I've been at Columbia now for 2.5 years, and it's the first time I've been in a private institution. So I went to public schools throughout my entire career. I went to public state colleges. I worked at public state colleges. So I do feel like an outsider in many ways, just in terms of being or learning kind of the norms of an elite institution and what that means. I have wonderful colleagues, and I get to work with amazing students, and so that makes it a great experience overall. But I think definitely navigating hidden norms and expectations, at a different type of institution has been a learning experience for me.
Was the other person that was nominated for valedictorian, were they white or were they a person of color too?
She was actually white and Asian.
Okay, let's talk about your book for a second. What is it about? Like, tell us more about that.
Yeah, so Learning in a Burning House, that was the first book that I authored, and it's based on my dissertation study, and it looks at African-American school superintendents. They were retired when I talked to them, but they went to all black segregated schools, and then they led school systems under desegregation. So there's a lot of talk about segregation and what that means in terms of educational opportunity, and I wanted to know from individuals who lived through it what that meant. How had things changed? What were some of the things that they learned in their, all black segregated schools? And how did that shape their leadership when they were then responsible for leading large school systems in the post-desegregation era? So it's basically a lot of their stories in terms of what they experienced, caring and demanding teachers, a community that had very high expectations for their educational growth and development, tight-knit communities that really sent the same message to all the children that, you will be successful and you will go on to college. And so it was interesting to see that these 8 individuals, even though they grew up in different parts of the country, had a very similar experience. Oftentimes in research, we are told that all black segregated schools are deficient, are lacking things, and that they need to be desegregated. And so the book really challenges that idea that there's something wrong with something being all black. That was one of the themes that came out. There's nothing wrong with something being all black was one of the key themes that came from the book. The other was that sometimes they felt like the problems actually started with desegregation. And so the dismantling of what was a tight-knit community that was disrupted in an attempt to desegregate schools was something that they talked about. And the third theme was this idea that we never really truly integrated. And so they challenged the whole idea that as a country we have actually gone through school integration, that we have mixed bodies, that we've moved children around, but that we haven't really arrived at the place where we see everybody as equals.
How do you think urban layouts and that integration that you talk about inhibits black advancement in right now?
How urban?
Layouts and urban planning inhibits black advancement.
Oh, definitely. I think all of the policies, the structures, the planning, many times that we may not focus on, certainly impacts the decisions that we make as human beings in terms of where we live, where we attend school, and whether or not we're able to access employment and housing. So it's exciting to see that the conversations around schools have really pushed into looking at housing in urban planning and development, the implications of economic development on pushing out and displacing communities, right? Gentrification is happening in most metropolitan areas across the country, and it's very racialized. And so what does that mean when a community may be benefiting from some economic development, but at the same time is being displaced and losing a lot of its culture and history?
Do you think that those people being in all black schools helped them because they had staff that they can identify with? Or do you think that integration is good? Because some people don't think it is, having black students with mainly white teachers.
Mm-hmm. That's the great question, and I think that's the big debate in many ways. I think, it's hard to be against integration in many ways because you're either viewed as an extremist or maybe someone who's bigoted, right? And I'm quoting an article that that asked the question, whose integration are we talking about, right? Because there's different ways of thinking about integration. The narratives from the superintendents that I spoke with, they had really positive experiences in having, again, those connections with their teachers. They felt were very loving and caring, but also very demanding. And so they talked about how their teachers stayed with them after school to work with them, that they didn't have to really battle assumptions about them being inferior in any way in all black settings. And so that the book really, again, lifts up some of those valued aspects of their experiences that don't get shared enough, I don't think. I do believe in integration and diversity. I just think that it's a process rather than an end. That shouldn't be the goal, but through integration we can better learn from one another.
How do you think policy could be better improved to reflect the sort of view that you want to see in schools?
Yeah, so I think that policy should take and could benefit from a more critical analysis. So I recently published a book with two professors, one Janelle Scott, who's at Berkeley, and Gary Anderson, who's at NYU. And we're really pushing a critical approach to looking at policy. And part of that is really centering the perspectives of the minoritized and the oppressed, right? So how do we make sure that we center the views of communities of color, of women, of individuals who typically haven't been central to these conversations around policy, and really learn from it, to listen and allow their experiences to help shape policy development and evaluation and accountability.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of policy, ladies, if you don't mind if I jump in for this one question here. Being that you're an associate professor at Columbia University and the work that you're doing in educational leadership, I'm in an educational leadership course right now. And one of the concerns that I have is, at least in the master's program I'm in, is we have not taken one course that deals unapologetically with implicit bias, racial microaggressions, or even the concern of trauma and racialized trauma. And so when we talk about the next generation of superintendents and principals that have to deal with policy, my question is, what is higher ed doing to say, okay, we need to develop our courses to address these issues that students would be facing?
Well, I certainly think it varies. It's a great question. I think it varies across institution. Yeah. I think as a field of education leadership, we have our own professional associations, and it's something that we're really looking at, I think, more intently than we ever have before. I mean, when I was a doctoral student a long time ago, we didn't talk about, I was actually discouraged from writing my dissertation.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, so I guess the one lesson in that is that you got to pursue the thing that you love, right? And even the questions that you're really interested in, because it's not popular. Some of these topics and the questions that you're asking, which are really incredible, right? They're not popular, they're controversial. Even though they're really not, they end up being, because we have such strong opinions about access to equality, opportunity, right, and education. At Columbia, in our ed leadership programs, we have a very strong commitment to issues of race and equity and justice. And it starts with our faculty, right? And so having the faculty that really explore this work as part of their research agenda, are comfortable and interested in having the difficult conversations that are necessary, we think is critical. Because if you are working as an education leader today in the U.S., you have to really be grounded in what it means to experience implicit and increasingly explicit bias, right?
Right.
And how that plays out, not only for students, but also for teachers and adults in the building and those relationships. So I'm not sure that we can do a good job preparing leaders without having that central to our curriculum.
Great.
So you work at Columbia and you went to a private college, so...
I went to public college.
Oh, okay. So did you see that professors, and do you still see professors encouraging white students more than students of color, or do you see it as even?
There's still work to do. Faculty of color still only comprise a very small number of professors overall. I don't have the numbers for Columbia or other places that I've worked, but it's not rare to be the only one. I'm not the only one at Columbia. But you can be easily in places where you're the only woman of color or the only person of color in a faculty or on a faculty. So in terms of mentoring, it has implications for that, right? It has implications for making sure that there are faculty that support the research interests that students might be interested in, if that makes sense. So if you're interested, for example, in the African American experience, and you go to a university where nobody does that work, you can see how it can be challenging to be able to be supported and kind of grow as a scholar. And so that's why increasing the number of people of color and women who get graduate degrees, who get PhDs, which I would encourage everyone to consider, and to go on and do that work so that you can help future generations is really, really important. So that representation does matter. No, I don't think it's equal, to answer your question.
Okay, so how do we change the fact that half the school system, like teachers and stuff, are white. Like, it's that. In the school, it's a lot of white teachers. Like, how do we, in college too, like, it's not a lot of black teachers. To put it, like, we don't even have black male teachers, not a lot. So, like, how do we change that? How do we change the perspective that being a teacher isn't bad? Like, how do you think we should push towards that?
Can I ask you that question? I'm interested as students what you think about why there's not enough representation of black teachers, including black men, and what needs to be done about it.
I think that because of like the way students get punished, we're often discouraged from seeing teachers as an actual resource that we're supposed to be using as an educational opportunity or tool for our own advancement. Rather, we're forced to kind of look at them as prison guards, more or less. And so I think if you look at it from that sort of dichotomy, it's easy to understand why students would be discouraged from going into teaching themselves.
I also think that they push sports more on African American students and like less. They make us feel like we shouldn't care about our education as much.
Who's we?
Like, I feel like we're conditioned to feel like we should focus more on sports and like ignore our education. And like in the media, we see like us being represented as goofy and dumb.
Thank you. What do you think?
I don't know.
Well, I think one important thing is to look at the history of why that is, right? I mean, when you had segregated schools, you had to have black teachers, right? And so in the desegregation era, that's really the first time that you had individuals teaching other people's children, right? And I would argue that that is something that we're still trying to figure out in terms of the cultural mismatch that can happen if individuals have a different set of cultural beliefs, perspectives, kind of ways of thinking about school, right? So with desegregation actually is where you lost a lot of black teachers because they were fired. They were not hired to work in integrated schools. Wow. They were also demoted from principalships because you had black principals, right? But they were no longer to serve as principals over white children. And so some of them would have to go back into teaching or leave the profession altogether. And again, it's one of the other, I think, realities that we have to address when we talk about the benefits of integration. There's also a cost, and it happens to be a cost to the community that we say we're trying to serve. I think we need to change the whole kind of landscape of education to make it something that young people would want to do as a profession. We have to pay teachers more, and we have to create the conditions that allow them to be successful.
Okay, so in the African American communities, right, we see black kids being diagnosed with ADHD, ADD, and other things, but we never hear of PTSD or like childhood trauma. So like it is a major health crisis. So why do you think we haven't taken it seriously? Like why haven't we done anything?
I feel like y'all know the answers to this.
I want to hear what you have to say.
I mean, you know, a simple answer is racism and racial capitalism, right? And so there is, unfortunately, I guess, a cost to really addressing these issues in ways, especially if we don't value the individuals that are suffering from not only individual trauma, but I would say community level trauma, right? Trauma is not my area, and so I can't speak to what is or what isn't happening specifically for children, but I do think that diagnoses and the identification of students, for example, as having special needs, a lot of times is connected to the additional resources that come with that, unfortunately. So yeah, I think that it depends. I can't make general statements about why that's happening or not, but I definitely think that we need to have more, we need to care about young people more.
Okay, so we know it's a problem. PTSD is a problem.
Right.
Now let's put it towards you. You know it's a problem. You have your own school. Let's say you're the principal of whatever, right? And you know it's a problem. What would you do to take charge? Like, what would you do to make sure that that doesn't happen in your school?
I would have counselors.
Not all counselors are or what's the word I'm looking for? Qualified.
I'd have qualified count. I mean, first I would have to, let's back up, right? I'd have to assess kind of what really is happening in the school, right?
Okay.
And then based on that, needs assessment, then develop and identify the supports, the individuals, and a vision for the school that's going to be able to support the students who are in the school.
Continuing with trauma, when instances of negative contact increase for children, leads to them being conditioned to think badly about themselves. So do you think teachers play a role in the overwhelming rate of like suicide and depression and trauma in Black students?
I think teachers have a very powerful role, and they can be the decisive element in terms of providing support and inspiration for a student, or actually further creating more trauma or harm. And I think that's why teaching, and one of my colleagues at Columbia gave a talk and mentioned this, it's a calling. And we don't really talk about it, I think, in those terms anymore. But if we think about teaching as a profession and as a calling, and that certain people are chosen to do that work, I think it could transform the way that we think about education, how we staff schools, and then what that would mean for students. But yeah, teachers have an incredible amount of power, as do school leaders. And it's my hope that we'll really put the students at the center, listen to student voice more, hear what the needs are, and then work to meet those needs rather than kind of deciding what we think is best or most important for students.
Dr. Horsford, I have a question. I just got back literally this morning from the My Brother's Keeper summit that was out in Oakland, California. And one of the things I've always found interesting is how siloed the nonprofit, philanthropic, and educational sector is, as well as the research sector. And that was definitely as much as, and it was a great event. But even there, I saw the siloing. What do you think can be done where there's better collaboration between all these sectors to improve not just education, but child development? And if I can just go into a real quick example, you're probably familiar with whether it be the work through Dr. Oscar Babin or others that do health disparity work, when they talk about how trauma impacts the cortex and, learning. But that seems to stay up in the research world, and it never gets down to us in here, the practical world, or philanthropy doesn't see that, and so there's no grants or, I can go on forever. I'm not going to because it's their world here. But I'm just curious in your take in terms of what you think can be done to more unsilo these various different sectors.
Lots of things. I don't know how quickly they could happen, but I think having a shared vision is one. And it sounds like a simple thing, but I don't know that there is a shared vision around what we're trying to do around education or creating healthy communities. I mean, and I'm saying across silos. I think there's clearly articulated visions within sectors. Right. Maybe not even in education, to be honest, but to do it across sector, I think you need the funding and support. So you mentioned the philanthropic community. Right. They have to fund people to do the work, because you need people to kind of liaise across sectors to do that work full time. And so that's something that I found in the work that we did in Las Vegas. I mean, we had a great community collaborative that we were developing as part of a Promise Neighborhoods grant, bringing in, health district, the schools, juvenile justice, Metro, the arts, everybody to kind of come to the table and think about how we're serving the same population. But there was no dedication to funding someone or a group of people to do that full time. And so I think we all become so busy in our silos that we don't have the time to dedicate to the more important collaborative work. But that by changing policy maybe and how we fund initiatives, that could be a vehicle for incentivizing people working together. And I think that some people just serve as bridgers. So I don't think it's possible for everyone to know everything about every area, but that there are probably a group of people who are really interested in working as the hub and serving as a liaison across sectors. And the more that we can identify those individuals and support them in their work, I think we can make those connections that could really ramp things up quickly.
Nice. Ladies, you have 3 closing questions.
Okay. Okay, so you said the lawmakers have the right to like change the policies and stuff, but it's not that many black people in like the making laws. Like, so like, how do we change that? Like, that's still like, it's still like, I don't have an answer to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's not gonna be done overnight, because you can't just expect it to be done overnight. But how do we get more black people in like the courthouses and stuff to change the laws? Because that's what we need. If we don't have black people to do that for us, because they don't know what we've been through. They don't experience the same thing we've been through. So how do we convince black people here? We need you in here to do that. And I'm not asking you the question is, how do we convince black people to change their mindset? Like, we need black people in like courthouses, but they're not going. So like, how do we convince them to go? Like, how do we convince them to support us?
Well, we do have some amazing black elected officials, black judges, people who work in these in different positions where they can enact policy or interpret laws. One is really making sure that we increase political participation and voter turnout. That is still something that's very important, and we have to have the candidates that we want to support to be able to do that. But after doing this for many years and actually being married to someone who's in politics, and someone who is very cynical about the process, don't get me wrong, it's not perfect, there still is great possibility and power in being a part of that process. And it's amazing what you can do with a committed group of people to make that change. And I just encourage young people to, access the educational experiences that are going to equip you to fulfill your own purpose. So whatever issues drive you, motivate you, keep you up at night, get the tools and the knowledge that you need to become an expert in that and to be able to really make change. And to build a connection and network of people that can support that work is really important. And who knows, you might be the one that should be the one in the courthouse to make those decisions and to be an advocate. And so I think we all have to think about what our role is and how we can prepare and develop ourselves to make the difference that we want to see. Because change won't come unless we change.
Do you think that like the health field and like psychology and counseling, do you think that should grow a lot?
Definitely, and that's certainly an area where black psychologists are underrepresented. And so, again, having those perspectives are important because we end up using a research base that does not include studies or perspectives that can be applied to other populations. So we have to be at the table. You have to be at the table, again, equip yourself and others to work through these problems. And not that I've given up on older folks, but I really do think that your generation and young people are going to be the ones that are going to help solve these problems. And that we should be the ones providing the tools and support to help you do that. So I'm really interested in knowing kind of what you think about where things are and what the future holds.
And do you think that black students and people are seen as tougher and that's why they don't get as much treatment as they need?
Definitely. We had a postdoctoral scholar at Columbia who spent a year there, and she looked at, for example, black women, one, the angry black woman trope, but also that the strong black woman kind of narrative, right? And that the strong black woman doesn't need support, can't really ask for help, always has to have it together. And she looked at the psychological impacts and the negative consequences of that. So her work was really around, and that's Dr. Marty Jones, was around kind of really pushing back on that narrative so that women could really get the support that they needed. So definitely stereotypes, the different assumptions that we have about people, that is the danger and power of race, because race is really just a political construction, right? It's not tied to our biology or genetics. It's kind of this idea that we attach meaning to, and it has power. And so we have to be the ones to change it.
How do you think we can go as young people about unlearning that Eurocentric narrative?
Well, we have to change the curriculum in K-12 schools. So that's one thing that I'm really increasingly interested in. I have a doctoral student who's looking at ethnic studies policies in states that have been successful in incorporating ethnic studies as part of their curriculum for K-12 schools. So we have to do a better job of understanding the country, who we are, how we fit into this narrative, so that we can change it. And I think that testing and accountability have limited the time that students have and teachers have to teach history, civics, philosophy, and the foundations. And that's why we're where we are now.
Okay, let's go back to your book for a second. You said you interviewed superintendents, principals, and all that. Did you interview students? Like, were the ones...
Did you read the book?
No,
Okay.
not yet. So that's what I'm asking.
I interviewed superintendents only because it was focused on, it was for a leadership program, and the focus was really on how we think about leadership and how leaders make decisions around these different difficult issues. I mean, arguably, I talked to them, but I was also having them reflect on their student experiences, which I think was a particularly unique aspect of this study, in that they kind of reflected on what it was like to be a student during a very different time, and then how that shaped who they are today. But I feel like there's more to your question.
Okay. I was going to disagree with you just a little
Go ahead,
bit.
please.
Because you said we are the future,
Mhm.
yeah? But then you don't ask us how we feel about having a whole black staff, or you didn't ask us as the students. You asked the teachers, who sometimes are wrong. So...
I asked which teachers?
the superintendents. Like, you spoke to them, and I feel like you left a part out, which is us. Since we are the future, we should have a say. Like, we should have had a say.
No, that's fair. It's one book, though.
Yeah, so it's going to be another one?
Well, yeah, this is one of 5.
Okay.
But no, I have not looked at students. I mean, there are scholars that look at it. It has not been my area. Mine has really focused on leadership and policy, but I certainly agree that student voice should be informing and shaping how we think about leadership and policy. So your point is taken.
Okay. Well, Dr. Horsford, we'd like to thank you for our podcast. Any closing comments or thoughts?
Questions.
I'm going to get you later. No, this was really, I just want to thank you for inviting me, for having me. I learned a lot, even through the questions that you asked, and I hope that we can continue the dialogue. And my big takeaway is, again, the need to really center student perspectives and voices. I think in education, particularly in education reform and policy, we spend a lot of time making plans and developing strategies and doing all these things that we believe are going to help students, but we rarely ask students. So I just want to thank you for your time and for speaking up and speaking out.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the African American Experience class here at Piscataway High School and The Experience. This is podcast series number 2, our interview with Dr. Sonya Horsford, Associate Professor at Columbia University. I'd like to thank our interviewers today, Ms. Angela Bodley, Ms. Gaelle Laurore, and Ms. Darshni Patel. Thank you and have a wonderful day, everyone.